They say the desert sun spares no one, branding its fiery mark into the earth, and the people who dare call this unforgiving land home. Somewhere in the vast expanse of sagebrush and endless horizons, a single rancher named Elias McKenna pushed his luck for the last time, staking everything he had on a bold, desperate move that would change his life forever. Bought at auction as cheap labor, the young woman named Hannah Calder arrived at the ranch under a swirl of dust and 100 whispered rumors. By sundown, she was Elias's wife. By dawn, nothing in that entire stretch of frontier would ever be the same again. Elias McKenna was born on a ranch just south of Dodge City, Kansas, in the year 1856. A lean, steely-eyed man hardened by sun and sorrow, Elias grew up working cattle drives along the Santa Fe Trail. By the time he was 21, the McKenna family ranch had folded under the weight of debt and disaster, leaving him with nothing but a pair of worn-down boots and a Colt revolver strapped to his hip. Determined to forge his own legacy, Elias ventured westward in search of fortune, or at least a chance to break even. He eventually staked a claim on a modest stretch of land near the banks of a trickling creek that promised enough water to keep a small herd alive. The soil was rocky, and the grass was far from lush. Yet Elias believed in the land's potential. If it was good enough for his father to dream on, it was good enough for him to try. He erected a makeshift cabin first, then a dilapidated barn for the 4 cattle he managed to purchase on credit. Life in that desert domain was an unending cycle of punishing days and lonesome nights where the only respite came from the rare trips into the nearest town, a dusty outpost called Silver Falls. Despite the humble name, Silver Falls was perched on commerce. It was a halfway meeting point for ranchers trailing their herds north to Abilene and gamblers drifting between Dodge City and Tombstone. Saloons, brothels, and supply stores lined the single muddy street, thriving on the money and vices of travelers passing through. Their shady horse traders, rugged ranch hands, and out-of-work cowboys seemed to come and go like tumbleweeds blown by the incessant wind. Elias's ranch struggled from the get-go. The first year, he lost a prized bull to a rattlesnake bite. The second year, half his meager herd died in a sudden blizzard. By the time the third year rolled around, he was scrambling for help, anyone strong enough to mend fences, brand cattle, and wrangle stray steers. But ranch hands didn't come cheap. Most demanded wages Elias could no longer afford, and the few who would work on credit were men with questionable backgrounds and wandering loyalties. Local rumor had it that Wyatt Earp himself once strolled through Silver Falls on his way to a far-flung gold strike. As was typical with legends of that era, stories swirled around the name. Did Wyatt Earp break up a brawl in the saloon, or did he sit quietly drinking whiskey in the corner? Nobody could say for sure. Tall tales floated through the west like dust in the wind, drifting from mouth to ear, shape-shifting to suit the teller's fancy. But to Elias, these rumors only underscored how transient and unpredictable life was. Heroes or villains could come and go without so much as a second thought. His neighbors were sparse old man Doolin down the way, who spent more time polishing his antique rifle than working his fields, and Mary Lou Hutchins, a widow who inherited her husband's sheep farm. While Mary Lou was kind enough, she had no hands to spare in helping another rancher. She was barely hanging on to her own enterprise. Periodically, she would show up at Elias's front door with a fresh-baked loaf of bread or a jug of goat's milk. In return, he'd help her fix broken fence posts. This arrangement of neighborly kindness was all that kept their small corner of the frontier from lapsing into total isolation. But small kindnesses would not save Elias from financial disaster. By the time he'd rubbed his eyes on that fateful morning and prepared to ride into Silver Falls, he had a heavy debt looming over him. The bank agent, Mr. Carlyle, had already paid a brisk visit to remind Elias that another defaulted loan payment might cost him the ranch. Elias spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by the wind, whipping against his cabin walls, envisioning his father's disappointed face in every gust of stinging dust. As he saddled his horse at the crack of dawn, Elias told himself that he would find a solution, some kind of cheap labor, or perhaps strike a deal with one of the roving ranch hands. Desperation clung to him like the trail dust on his boots. He never realized that by sundown he would not just solve his labor problems, but change the course of his entire life. Tethering his horse in front of the Silver Falls Mercantile, Elias noticed a commotion down the street. A crowd was gathering near the old stage depot. Voices raised a makeshift platform erected. The jumbled noise of an auctioneer's patter wafted through the air, underscored by an uneasy tension. Auctions were commonplace horses' cattle land. Sometimes entire businesses went under the hammer. But as Elias moved closer, pushing past an onlooker or two, realized that this was no ordinary auction of livestock or property. The figure on the wooden platform was not a horse or a steer. It was a human being, a young woman, shackled at the wrists, shoulders tense under the blazing sun. Eyes lowered, she looked neither defiant nor defeated, merely exhausted. Her clothes were little more than ragged homespun. A hush swept across the crowd every so often, as though they themselves couldn't quite believe they were witnessing such a thing. The auctioneer was a wiry man in a dusty bowler hat. He gestured to the girl and bellowed, 18 years old, strong enough for ranch work or housekeeping, whichever suits the buyer. We have a bill of sale from her previous caretaker. The words caretaker triggered an uneasy murmur. The official line was that she was being sold as an indentured servant to pay off a debt, but many in that crowd recognized the darker subtext. People had been sold this way before, sometimes freed, sometimes exploited. The line between law and moral wrongdoing could be damnably blurred in certain pockets of the frontier. Elias felt a flush of disgust, but also an odd sense of possibility. He needed help. He needed someone who wouldn't demand high wages. He told himself that maybe, just maybe, if he managed to purchase her indenture, he could provide her a better life than drifting from unscrupulous ranch to unscrupulous ranch. It was an uncomfortable justification, but desperation has a way of bending a man's moral compass. He wasn't alone. Several rough-looking men and a couple of ranchers from further east were murmuring amongst themselves, eyebrows raised. A few snapped out offers in harsh tones. The price started low, $50, then $60, then $70. The air seemed to sizzle with each additional bid. The young woman's gaze flickered, but she remained mostly stoic. She was likely used to being passed along like a commodity. Her posture told a story of endless endurance, each new humiliation piling on top of the last. Elias's heart thudded. The guilt gnawed at him, but the logic remained. He was in dire straits. If no one else was going to do right by this poor girl, perhaps he could. He could bring her to the ranch, feed her, clothe her, treat her, fairly pay off her indenture, and eventually grant her freedom. He tried to stifle the swirl of conflicting emotions. 75 called a man named Gus Pemberton, a notorious gambler rumored to have ties with outlaws up in the hills. Gus eyed the girl with a reptilian grin that made Elias's stomach turn. Elias forced himself to speak up. 80. His voice echoed in the still air, surprising even himself. Gus's grin soured. 90, he shot back. Elias clenched his jaw. Could he afford to go higher? He thought of his battered ledger back at the ranch, the red lines underlining what little finances he had left. But then he looked at the girl, her weary eyes framed by dust-streaked cheeks. Could he stomach leaving her to Gus Pemberton's cruelty? Probably not. 100, Elias said firmly. A stir ran through the crowd. $100 in Silver Falls was no small sum. But Gus wasn't done. 115. Elias felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of his neck. The midday sun battered him, and the sense that this moment was about more than just ranch labor pressed down on him. 120, he called. The auctioneer's eyes flicked between them. 120. Any more takers? 120. Gus hesitated, then spat in the dirt. Hell with it. I'm out. He shot Elias a venomous glare. The auctioneer slammed down his gavel. Sold. To Elias McKenna for $120. A scattered applause, more out of relief than celebration, whispered through the crowd. People began to disperse, minds already turning to the next gossip or chore. The auctioneer jumped off the platform, rummaged through his satchel for a bundle of papers. Sign here, he muttered, barely looking Elias in the eye. We'll collect your funds, and then she's yours. The words made Elias feel slightly ill. She's yours. He signed, ignoring the scornful look from Gus. Pay up, the auctioneer, said, arms crossed. Elias peeled out a stack of crinkled bills money, earmarked for feed supplies and the upcoming loan payment. But there was no turning back now. The transaction complete, the auctioneer unshackled the young woman. She stepped off the platform, massaging her wrists. Elias swallowed hard. Name's Elias McKenna, he introduced quietly. Well, we'll get you fed. And... He paused, feeling deeply awkward. What's your name? She looked at him, perhaps gauging whether he was friend or foe. Hannah Calder, she said softly. Elias nodded, unsure what else to say. I won't keep you in chains. Let's head to the mercantile. Get you something to eat. Maybe pick up some things you need. Then we'll go to my ranch. She said nothing, only a slight nod. Her eyes glimmered with a mixture of cautious hope and resignation. Elias led her by the elbow, weaving through the thinning crowd, the stares, the muted murmurs. In his mind, a single thought rumbled. What have I just done? Standing in the mercantile. Elias watched Hannah eye the shelves of simple dresses and coarse aprons. She appeared overwhelmed by the sudden freedom to choose anything for herself. Elias quietly purchased a decent outfit for her, a simple calico dress and sturdy boots. He noticed the storekeeper's raised eyebrows at the sight of them together, but nobody said a word. If they judged him, they kept it behind closed lips. Outside, the sun still blazed high. Elias found himself scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. Part of him worried that Gus Pemberton might come skulking around to cause problems. Another part worried that some official might question the ethics of how and why he had acquired an indentured servant. The law out here was inconsistent at best. They made their way to the saloon for a quick meal. While saloons typically weren't places for polite company, Silver Falls boasted only one eatery, and that was it. Inside gamblers and cowpokes sized them up. Elias guided Hannah to an empty table in the corner. A waitress named Josephine, a friend of Mary Lou Hutchins, bustled over with a small but kind smile. "What can I get you folks?" Hannah stared at the table, still uncertain. Elias cleared his throat. "Some stew, some water, maybe bread, if you've got it." Josephine nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Moments later, a familiar voice rumbled from behind. "Heard you bought yourself some company, McKenna. Didn't figure you for the type." Elias stiffened. It was Morton Mort Avery, the self-appointed toughest rancher in these parts, broad-shouldered and always itching for confrontation. Mort wore an oily grin leaning over the table. "Young too," he added with an infuriating wink at Hannah, who kept her eyes down. "You planning to keep her as more than a ranch hand?" Elias fought the urge to lash out. Instead, he said in a level tone, "She's here to help me on the ranch. I paid for her indenture so she wouldn't fall into worse hands." Mort barked a laugh, drawing a few stares from the patrons. "That's a mighty sweet story. Word is you're teetering on the edge. The bank's hounding you, ain't it? You're so broke, I'm surprised you had the money to buy a cup of water, let alone a labor girl." Elias set his jaw. "You don't know a thing about it, Mort. Now, if you don't mind, leave us be." Mort shrugged, but his gaze drifted to Hannah in a way that made Elias's blood run hot. Eventually, Mort ambled off, presumably satisfied with his attempt to poke holes in Elias's dignity. They ate in relative silence. Hannah sipped the stew tentatively, as if she half expected someone to yank the bowl away. Once they finished, Elias paid and motioned for Hannah to follow him outside. The weight of stares and half-heard whispers clung to them like smoke. Outside, the angle of the sun told Elias they'd need to start the journey back soon if they wanted to reach the ranch before nightfall. They were loading supplies onto his horse when a voice came from behind a voice that carried an air of authority. Elias McKenna. The speaker was Sheriff Martin Tolland, a tall, wiry man with a bushy mustache and an expression that rarely softened. "Heard about your purchase at the auction." Elias turned slowly, his heart hammering. "Sheriff," he greeted. Hannah ducked her head, stepping slightly behind Elias, as though for protection. Tolland studied them. "I gotta ask, what are your intentions with the girl?" Elias cleared his throat. "She'll work on my ranch. I'll treat her fairly. Feed her, pay off the remainder of her indenture. When her time is done, she's free. Simple as that." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Hope so. We don't have the workforce to investigate every personal arrangement in these parts, but I keep my eyes open. If I hear anything untoward, I'll come calling." Elias glanced at Hannah, who stared at the ground. "Understood." Tolland considered them for a moment, then gave a curt nod and wandered away. Elias sighed, turning back to Hannah. "I'm not the monster they think I am," he told her, voice low. "My ranch, it's small, struggling, but I aim to be honest, keep you safe." She met his gaze for a moment, and in those green eyes he saw a flicker of trust, or perhaps a longing for it. "Thank you," she said softly. "I didn't have a choice in that auction. I'm grateful you outbid that gambler." She paused as if wrestling with her next words. "Still, I know what people might expect from me." Elias frowned. "You won't have to." He stopped. The words felt too raw to speak aloud. He was no saint, but forced intimacy was out of the question. "All I expect is help with chores and some conversation in the lonely evenings." Her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. They mounted up and headed out of town, the sinking sun painting the dusty road in a golden glow. The ride was long and neither spoke much. The hush of the wild land enveloped them. Every once in a while, Elias caught Hannah looking at the horizon, a distant sadness etched across her face. He wondered about her life before the auction. Who had raised her? How did she end up on that platform? He didn't ask, not yet. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun hovered low, kissing the edges of the horizon with blood-orange fire. The battered cabin and listing barn looked even more meager in that dramatic light. But it was home. Elias dismounted, helped Hannah down. She studied her new surroundings, the rickety corral, a single water trough, a few scrawny cattle standing behind the barn. "It's not much," Elias said with a self-conscious laugh, "but I hope it's better than what you left behind." Hannah attempted a smile. "It's quiet." He nodded, leading her inside. The single-room cabin contained a small stove, a roughly made table, one bed, and a side cot. Elias set about lighting an oil lamp. Shadows flickered, dancing across the rough-hewn walls. "Take the bed tonight," he offered. "I'll sleep on the cot." Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. "But this is your home?" He shrugged. "Figured you'd want the chance to rest after all you've been through." She exhaled gratitude, shaping her features in the lamplight. "Thank you." An awkward stillness settled between them. Outside, the cicadas started their nightly symphony. Elias busied himself with the lamp and the stove, rummaging through cupboards for something to offer Hannah. But there wasn't much, a bit of salted pork, some beans, a half loaf of bread. She shook her head at the offer, claiming the stew in town was enough for now. He looked at her, remembering the startled hush among the crowd, recalling Mort Avery's insinuations. Then a peculiar notion took root in his mind. He'd always heard stories of men who quickly married to secure property claims or to settle moral ambiguities about living arrangements. The line between practicality and moral rectitude blurred in the West, especially when it came to single men and single women. It was a wild thought, but Elias spoke it anyway, the words tumbling out almost without permission, Hannah. "This might sound strange, but if I were your husband, no one could question you being here or how I treat you. It would give you some protection. You'd have legal status, not just be some indentured servant that folks gossip about." She blinked, stunned. "Marry you?" She echoed, her voice low. Elias swallowed, pressing on. "I'm not offering romance, but maybe it'd keep the sheriff off your back and men like Mort Avery away from you. You'd at least be recognized legally. I'm sure you'd be safer. Maybe that's not important to you." He paused, feeling foolish. Hannah's gaze slid to the worn floorboards. She was quiet for so long that Elias wondered if she was going to outright refuse or run into the desert. But then she spoke, voice trembling with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "If you think that's best. I trust your intentions more than other men I've met." She squared her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Yes, I'll do it." Those last words seemed to echo in the small cabin. They looked at each other, two souls battered by the harshness of life, each seeing a flicker of unexpected salvation in the other. Without further discussion, Elias found the old Bible that had belonged to his father, and they stood near the flickering lamp, exchanging vows with more sincerity than many a fancier wedding. The sun had not yet fully set, but its red disk had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in ribbons of pink and purple. When the last whispered vow was spoken, Elias gently placed a weathered band of copper, an old token he'd once found near a dried-up river onto Hannah's finger. It wasn't a grand wedding band, but it was all he had. They shared a solemn moment of silence, acknowledging that although this marriage began in practicality, it might yet grow into something else. In that strange hush, the final rays of day surrendered to night, heralding a new reality for both bride and groom. By sundown, they were husband and wife. Hannah awoke to the rooster's crow, the first hints of dawn creeping through the thin cracks in the cabin walls. She shifted on the modest bed, still unused to such comfort. For a moment she forgot the previous day's whirlwind events, auctioned the dusty ride, the vow, and simply enjoyed the sensation of having a bed to herself. Then reality settled in, and she glanced over at Elias, still asleep on the cot near the far wall. She quietly rose, careful not to wake him. Slipping outside, she breathed in the crisp morning air. The land was eerily beautiful at dawn. Dew sparkled on the scrub grass, and the sky was brushed with pale pink and gold. She had known so little of beauty in her life. Stolen glimpses of sunrise through dirty windows or ephemeral patches of wildflowers near the rutted roads she'd travelled. But here there was space for the sky to unfold infinite and alive. She saw the few cattle huddled behind the barn, lowing softly. The ranch was modest, but there was a calm determination in the way it claimed its corner of the wilderness. The battered fencing, the leaning barn, the dusty corral, it spoke of grit and perseverance, much like the man who owned it. Elias emerged from the cabin, eyes puffy with the remnants of sleep. Morning, he greeted in a half-yawn, half-grumble. "Good morning, Hannah," replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I was about to fetch water. Is there a well or—" Elias nodded toward a short distance beyond the cabin. "Old well near the creek. We can head there together." They walked side by side, carrying a couple of buckets. Along the way, Elias explained how water was scarce in the heat of summer, but the small creek usually carried enough flow to top off the well. Hannah listened attentively, storing every detail. She wanted to be useful, wanted to show Elias that he hadn't made a mistake in trusting her. While drawing water, Elias studied her from the corner of his eye. She moved with an air of competence, her expression intent. "Have you done ranch chores before?" he asked gently. "Not exactly, but I've worked in a farm's kitchen and in a stable. I can manage livestock and housework," she replied. She hesitated, then offered, "I'd like to learn more about ranching, though fencing, riding, anything that needs doing." Elias nodded, impressed by her willingness. "We can start simple, but you'll learn quick. Ranch life doesn't leave much room for idling." They carted the water back to the cabin, their shoulders already dusted by the rising sun's warmth. Elias set about preparing a simple breakfast of beans and leftover bread. They ate quietly, the hush of a new morning settling around them. After breakfast, Elias gave her a quick tour of the ranch, the small cattle pen, the feed store inside the barn, the meager patch of vegetables that valiantly tried to grow in the rough soil. Hannah paid attention to everything, eyes scanning her new domain. "Well," Elias said, hands perched on his hips, "we'll have to work on the fence today. A few of the posts are rotted, and if the cattle slip out, I'll be chasing them across half the territory." Hannah rolled up her sleeves. "Show me what to do, and I'll get it done," she said with a tiny smile. They spent the day hauling new posts from a small pile of lumber Elias had scraped tight together. The scorching sun beat down, turning every labor into a test of endurance. But Hannah refused to complain, even when beads of sweat trickled down her temples, or when her back ached from digging post holes. She'd known worse conditions. The difference here was that the man working beside her treated her with an unspoken respect. They labored shoulder to shoulder, meeting each other's gaze now and then, with shared determination. By late afternoon, they'd replaced several sections of fence. They collapsed against a shady corner of the barn, panting in the dusty air. Elias noticed a faint sunburn beginning to redden Hannah's cheeks. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small salve. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "It's aloe from Mary Lou Hutchins. Put it on your face tonight, it'll help with the burn." She studied the small tin, a hint of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you." He shrugged. "It's just salve." But the moment felt heavier than that. Two souls forging a cautious bond in the middle of nowhere, each kind gesture more significant than either dared admit. They lingered there for a moment in the barn's shade, listening to the quiet rasp of wind through dry grass. Outside, the horizon shimmered in the late-day heat. Over in the distance, the cattle dozed, oblivious to the new tension that occasionally flickered between husband and wife. That night, they shared a simple supper of jerky and beans. They talked a bit about the next day's tasks, mending the barn roof, checking on the creek. Then, after blowing out the lamp, Hannah retired to the bed, and Elias curled up on the cot, neither quite sure how to address the fact that they were now legally bound. But in the hush of the night, a fragile sense of security warmed them both enough to slip into dreams without too much anxiety about tomorrow. A week passed, then two. Their small routines fell into a steady rhythm early mornings, water hauling, fence mending, cattle checking, evening meals, and the faint flicker of companionship by lamplight. Elias taught Hannah how to saddle and ride his old mare, explaining the fundamentals of reining and pacing. She quickly grasped the skills, relishing the small sense of freedom that came from galloping across the dusty fields. Word spread in Silver Falls that Elias had married the labor girl he'd bought at auction. Whispers trailed them on their occasional supply runs. Some whispered that he'd done it to claim her body as well as her work. Others speculated he was simply that desperate for help. Still others suggested a flicker of genuine decency in a harsh world. Mort Avery was seen drunkenly joking that Elias was too broke to buy a real wife, stirring laughter among his cronies. Such rumors eventually reached the ears of Sheriff Tolland, who kept watchful. One afternoon, as Elias and Hannah were tying up their horse outside the mercantile, Tolland approached, tipping his hat. "McKenna." "Miss Hannah. Mrs. McKenna." "I suppose," he corrected. "I hear the ranch is up and running. You doing all right out there?" Elias looked him in the eye. "Yes, Sheriff. We're managing." Hannah offered a tentative nod. "Thank you for asking." Tolland pursed his lips thoughtfully. "Town's abuzz with talk about you two. Don't let it get to your heads or break your spirits. Folks in these parts love to gossip, especially about matters they can't understand." Elias nodded. "Appreciate the warning, Sheriff." They went about their shopping, ignoring the stares. At the general store, they loaded up on flour, sugar, coffee nails, and a new spade. Hannah quietly selected some cloth for sewing. Her dress was starting to tear from ranch work. Then, stepping outside, they almost collided with Gus Pemberton, flanked by two rough-looking men. "Well, well," Gus sneered, adjusting his hat. "Look who it is. Mir and Mrs. McKenna." His gaze fell on Hannah, lingering in a way that set Elias's nerves on edge. "I see you've been keeping her busy. She looks a bit scrawny. You feeding your wife enough?" Elias stepped forward. "Shut your mouth, Gus. You don't talk to my wife." Gus raised his palms in mock surrender. "Whoa, big man, don't get it jumpy. Just checking in. Had my eye on her at the auction, remember?" A predatory grin spread across his face. "Guess you got lucky." Or maybe she did. Hard to tell. Elias felt Hannah tense at his side. He wanted to pummel Gus into the ground, but fighting in broad daylight on Main Street would only draw the sheriff's wrath. So he forced himself to exhale, then turned away. "Let's go, Hannah." Gus's laughter followed them as they walked off. "Careful, McKenna. The West ain't always kind to those who bite off more than they can chew." They loaded up their supplies and rode back to the ranch. The storm clouds of looming conflict hovered in Elias's mind. Gus was trouble, the kind that stirred up violence just for the thrill of it. For years, rumors tied Gus Pemberton to rustling cattle, cheating travelers at cards, and even harboring outlaws. If the man had set his sights on them, out of spite, Elias worried about how far he might go. That evening they scarcely spoke while unloading the goods. The tension coiled between them like a snake. Finally, after dinner, Hannah couldn't hold it in. "Elias, what if Gus tries to harm us? You know, he's not just talk. I've seen men like him before." Elias nodded grimly. "We'll take precautions. Keep the rifle loaded, the revolver close." He glanced around the small cabin, feeling its frailty. "But I doubt he'll come at us head-on. Not with Tolland in town." She bit her lip. "Still, it scares me." Elias hesitated, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I won't let him hurt you." For a moment, she let herself lean into that promise, drawing comfort from his quiet strength. Then, with a nod, she pulled back. The topic remained heavy on their minds as they said goodnight, the glow of the lamp casting shadows across the cabin walls. In the darkness, lying on his cot, Elias stared at the ceiling, thoughts churning. The bank loan was coming due soon. He had to raise enough money to pay at least the interest or risk losing the ranch altogether. Meanwhile, Gus Pemberton loomed like a spectre waiting to exploit any weakness. And in the midst of it all, Hannah, his wife, lay just a few feet away, stolen from an auction block into a life that might not be any safer. But a new resolve flickered within him. He would do everything in his power to make this ranch thrive, to protect Hannah, to prove they could carve out a decent life, despite the odds. Tomorrow was another day, and in the West, a new day could bring either hope or disaster. Sometimes both. As the weeks rolled on, Elias noticed the pressure building around him, like a dam threatening to burst. The cattle count was too low. The pasture was drying up under a relentless sun. The bank's deadline inched closer with every sunrise. He tried not to let Hannah see just how worried he was. But she picked up on the signs anyway. His restless nights, his distant looks toward the horizon. One scorchingly hot afternoon, Mr. Carlyle, the bank agent, rode up. A pale man with round spectacles, Carlyle wore a crisp suit that seemed absurd in the dusty climate. He dismounted and greeted Elias with a stiff courtesy before looking around, faint disdain on his features. "Afternoon," Elias said, tipping his hat, his heart pounding. Carlyle wasted no time. "I'm here to inspect your property, Mr. McKenna, and gauge your ability to repay your debt. The bank demands a full accounting within 2 weeks. If you cannot meet the minimum payment, we will be forced to foreclose." Elias swallowed. "I'm working on it. I've made improvements. The fence is fixed, the cattle are healthy. I just need a little more time." Carlyle's gaze drifted to Hannah, who stood in the doorway of the barn. "And this is your wife, I hear." "Yes," Elias answered, voice tight. He didn't elaborate. Carlyle pulled out a clipboard, scanning some notes. "I see. The bank was informed you purchased an indentured servant. That must have cost you quite a sum. Hannah stiffened, her cheeks flushing. Elias took a step toward Carlyle, voice tense. That's our business. Carlyle shrugged. Certainly. As long as you can repay the loan, no further questions asked. He spent the next hour strolling around the property with an air of condescension, scribbling in his notebook about the land's value, the number of cattle, the sorry state of the barn. Finally, he turned back to Elias. I'm afraid your improvements don't account for the bleak market. Cattle prices are low, and the bank has no interest in extended leniency. 2 weeks, Mr. McKenna. Bring your payment or prepare to vacate. With that, Carlyle remounted and rode off, leaving a swirl of dust in his wake. Elias stood there, fists clenched at his sides. Hannah approached quietly. Elias, we'll figure something out, she said, though worry laced her tone. Could we sell something or maybe find extra work in town? He shook his head, face grim. I can't leave the ranch for day labor, not with the fences needing constant watch, and I own barely enough cattle for breeding. Selling them off would cripple the ranch. Hannah bit her lip, scanning the horizon as if searching for an answer in the swaying mirage of heat. Then maybe I can work in town. Cleaning, sewing, something. It might bring in a little money. The thought of Hannah returning to a vulnerable position in Silver Falls twisted Elias's stomach. But the desperate logic was undeniable. If they didn't come up with at least part of the money, everything they'd fought for would be gone. He managed a nod. We'll think it over. I appreciate the offer. That night, the dinner conversation was subdued. The weight of looming foreclosure hung between them. Elias stared into his tin cup of coffee, swirling the dark liquid as though it held the key to his problems. Eventually, Hannah broke the silence. What if we took on more cattle, maybe from a neighbor, to graze here? We could get a share of the profit. I've heard of ranchers doing that. Elias rubbed his chin. That might work if we had a neighbor with cattle to spare. But the only ones near enough are Mary Lou Hutchins with her sheep and Old Man Doolin, who barely has 2 scrawny steers. Everyone else is miles away. They fell silent again until finally Elias sighed. We'll ride into town tomorrow, talk to folks, see if there's any arrangement to be made. One way or another, we'll come up with the payment. I'm not losing this ranch. Hannah nodded, feeling the quiet determination in his words. For both of them, the ranch had become more than just land. It was a sanctuary, a promise of self-sufficiency, and possibly the only place where they could attempt a semblance of peace. The next morning, they saddled the horse and made their way to Silver Falls Hearts, heavy with uncertainty. The sun glinted off the tin roofs of the scattered buildings, and the ever-present dust swirled under the hooves of their mare. In town, they went door to door, politely asking if anyone needed extra help that could pay enough to chip away at their debt. Hannah inquired at the mercantile about sewing work. They took her name, but said they couldn't promise much. Elias asked at the livery stable, the blacksmith's shop, anywhere he could think of. Each time the wages offered were meager, the tasks either short-term or already filled by other desperate folk. By midday, they'd gathered only a handful of small leads, a few dollars here, a few there, hardly enough to dent the loan. Disheartened, they decided to rest in the saloon for a cold drink, hoping to overhear some opportunity. Inside, the atmosphere was languid, slow-moving. A piano tinkled in the corner. A few ranch hands lounged at tables. Hannah attracted curious glances, but she'd grown used to it. Elias ordered 2 lemonades, ignoring the raised eyebrows of men expecting him to ask for whiskey. They sipped their drinks and were about to leave when a booming voice from the entrance startled them. Well, ain't this a surprise? They turned to see Gus Pemberton swaggering in, flanked by 2 men. He spotted Elias and Hannah immediately, an oily grin sliding across his face. Elias tensed, half rising from his chair. Hannah's hand brushed his forearm, a silent plea for caution. Gus approached their table. "Afternoon, McKenna." "Mrs. McKenna." He tipped his hat mockingly at Hannah. "I hear you're in a bit of a financial pinch." Elias narrowed his eyes. "What's it to you?" Gus raised an eyebrow, sliding into a chair without invitation. Now, no need for hostility. I might have a proposition." Hannah exchanged a wary glance with Elias. Gus snapped his fingers at the bartender for a drink, then leaned in. "You see, I've got a small enterprise out in the hills. Some private dealings, let's call it. I could use someone with ranching knowledge to manage a certain set of livestock. The pay could be substantial." Elias's gut churned. "You talking about stolen cattle?" Gus's grin widened. "I'd never use such a word. Let's say there are a few herds that need to be quietly fostered. You keep them on your land feed and brand them with a mark I give you. When the time's right, we sell them, nobody's the wiser. You get a healthy cut, enough to pay off any loan, I'd wager." Hannah felt her stomach twist in revulsion. Elias glared at Gus. "That's rustling pure and simple. I won't be a part of it." Gus made a show of looking wounded. "Rustling? Come on, it's business. Folks lose a cow or 2 all the time. A brand can be confused in the log. It's how the West works, friend." Elias stood abruptly, fists clenched. "We're done here." Gus leaned back, taking a leisurely swig of his whiskey. "Suit yourself. But consider this, that bankman's coming for you. Sheriff Tolland can't do much about a foreclosure. A little side deal with me might be the only way to keep that land you love so much, and keep that pretty wife of yours fed and sheltered. I doubt you can afford to be so righteous." Hannah tugged Elias's sleeve. He glanced at her face, saw the anxiety. Without another word, he led her out of the saloon. Gus's laughter followed them onto the wooden sidewalk. Outside, Elias's head pounded. The midday sun felt oppressive. He noticed Hannah trembling slightly, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and concern. "You all right?" he asked softly, placing a hand on her arm. She nodded, though her lips were pressed in a thin line. "He's pushing you into something illegal, something that would destroy us if we're caught." Elias exhaled tension radiating from every muscle. "I'd rather lose the ranch than become Gus Pemberton's lackey." Hannah swallowed. "Me too." "But what if the bank does take the ranch? Where do we go?" He shook his head, feeling despair's cold weight. "I don't know." They decided to visit Mary Lou Hutchins on their way back, hoping for any advice or help. Mary Lou lived a few miles out of town in a small but well-kept farmhouse. Her flock of sheep grazed on the dry grass, guarded by a scrawny dog named Patch. Mary Lou greeted them warmly, ushering them inside and offering fresh biscuits. When Elias explained the dire situation, Carlyle's demands, Gus's proposition, she frowned. "That Gus is a snake," she said firmly. "I'm sorry you have to deal with him, but I agree. Don't stoop to rustling." Elias nodded, relief flickering at her support. "Any ideas about how we might raise enough money in 2 weeks?" Mary Lou drummed her fingers on the table. "There's a traveling livestock auction in Thompson's Gulch next week. I hear prices are higher up there. Maybe you could sell some smaller livestock or even old equipment." Elias grimaced. "Don't have much to sell." Hannah, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke. "What about the wild mustangs in the hills? Could we catch a few and sell them at the auction?" Mary Lou raised her eyebrows. "Wild mustangs are tricky. Takes skill to catch and break them, and time is short." Elias considered. "I've wrangled mustangs once or twice, but never alone." Mary Lou's expression turned thoughtful. "I might know a ranch hand or two who could help. For a split of the profits, of course." The plan was far from guaranteed. Wild horses were notoriously difficult to corral. It was a dangerous endeavor that could end with injury or empty pockets. But it was legal, and if they managed to bring a handful of decent horses to the auction, they might fetch enough to keep the bank at bay. They spent the afternoon discussing logistics. Mary Lou promised to round up any help she could find. Elias and Hannah would need to prepare rope feed and possibly build a temporary corral in the hills. It was a gamble, but with foreclosure looming, they had little choice. As they departed Mary Lou's place, the sun dipping low, Elias felt a cautious flicker of hope. At least there was a plan, risky, but better than letting Gus Pemberton drive them into a life of crime. The frontier rewarded the bold, or so the old saying went. They had no choice but to be bold now. In the days that followed, Elias and Hannah poured everything into their last shot at saving the ranch wild mustangs. Mary Lou connected them with two helping hands, Manuel Gonzalez, a skilled tracker, and Jim Dusty Walker, a cowboy with a colorful past. They scouted the hills at dawn, eventually spotting a band of mustangs near a cliff. Elias, Manuel, and Dusty set the plan in motion, herd the horses into a makeshift corral they'd strung between rocky formations. When the stallion sensed danger, the herd bolted. Dust flew, hooves pounded, and shouts echoed as the men worked to drive the horses toward the trap. The stallion outmaneuvered them, leading some away, but they managed to capture 4. It was a start. Over the week, they repeated the exhausting chase. Some days they caught another mare or two. Hannah helped build temporary pens and kept their spirits steady. Though bruised and blistered, Elias felt renewed. This was honest work, and Hannah's grit inspired him. By week's end, they had 6 mustangs. Manuel believed they could fetch good prices at the upcoming auction in Thompson's Gulch, especially if the horses were gentled slightly. Hope flickered, but hope came with risk. One evening they returned from the hills to find a message chalked on their barn door. "Only a fool says no. You'll pay McKenna." Hannah's face paled. "Gus," she whispered. Elias's jaw tightened. "He's threatening us now." Mary Lou urged them to report it, but Elias knew without proof the sheriff's hands would be tied. Still, the warning was clear. That night, Elias sat in the dark with a loaded rifle across his lap, keeping watch while Hannah slept. The silence was heavy, pierced only by the wind. The mustangs were secured. The auction was days away, and Gus Pemberton was lurking in the shadows, wounded pride turning dangerous. Yet as Elias watched Hannah sleep, he steeled himself. Whatever storm Gus brought next, he'd face it head-on. He had something to protect now, something worth fighting for. The morning of the auction broke hot and bright, with no clouds in sight. Elias, Hannah, Manuel, Dusty, and Mary Lou loaded the 6 captured mustangs into a borrowed wagon, their hopes riding with each stomping hoof. The road to Thompson's Gulch was rough, but the auction yard, when they arrived, buzzed with life ranchers, traders, and cavalry officers milled around, sizing up livestock and scanning for deals. Their mustangs immediately drew attention. A cavalry sergeant eyed the wild horses. Fine-looking stock. Strong bloodlines. Elias nodded. Silver Falls Hills. Tough ones out there." The man nodded approvingly. Soon the Mustangs entered the auction ring. Elias stood with Hannah at the fence, his heart thumping with each chant of the auctioneer. Prices climbed 30, 45, 55. One by one, the horses sold for more than expected. The final mare fetched the highest bid of all, sealing their chance at paying off the bank loan. Elias laughed with relief, hugging Hannah tightly. "We did it," he whispered. For the first time in weeks, real hope shone in his eyes. But their triumph was short-lived. Gus Pemberton emerged from the crowd, face dark. "Well, look who managed to wriggle free." Elias faced him warily. "It's done, Gus. We've got what we need." Gus leaned in. "Ever wonder why the bank was so quick to come for your land?" I nudged Carlyle, made him eager. "Thought I'd scoop up your ranch once you folded." He spat. "Didn't count on you chasing wild horses." As Gus stepped closer, one of his cronies reached for a gun. Hannah shouted Elias. In a heartbeat, Manuel and Dusty drew their weapons. Gunshots cracked through the dusty air. Chaos erupted, shouts, galloping hooves, screams. Elias felt a sting across his shoulder, then saw Gus's man fall wounded but alive. Gus dragged the injured man upright. "This isn't over, McKenna." His glare drifted to Hannah. "We'll finish it." Then he and his gang melted into the crowd. Hannah rushed to Elias's side. "You're bleeding." "Just a graze," he muttered. Mary Lou called for a doctor, and the group hurried to a nearby tent. The wound was shallow, but the threat was real. Gus had crossed the line into violence. Still, they had won the day. The Mustangs had bought them time, safety, and a piece of freedom. As Elias leaned into Hannah's embrace, he knew the fight wasn't over. But for once, they had a fighting chance. 2 days later, back at the ranch, Elias found himself gingerly flexing his bandaged shoulder. The doctor had stitched the wound, leaving Elias stiff but grateful to be alive. Hannah fussed over him, applying fresh salve each morning. Each gentle touch reminded Elias how far they'd come from the day of that fateful auction. With the Mustang profits in hand, Elias rode into Silver Falls, accompanied by Manuel for safety, and met with Carlyle. The bank agent's smug demeanor soured when Elias plunked the required payment on his desk, plus a little extra for good measure. Carlyle composed himself, sniffing disapproval. "I see you've managed to secure funds. Very well. We shall consider the loan current." Elias forced a polite smile. "Pleasure doing business." As they exited, Manuel slapped Elias on the back, gently mindful of the injury, and grinned. "That's one less chain around your neck, amigo." Elias nodded, relief coursing through him. They returned to the ranch where Hannah and Mary Lou waited. The moment he announced the debt was settled, Hannah flung her arms around him, a rare, radiant smile lighting up her face. Mary Lou clapped her hands in delight. "Bless the Lord, you've done it." In the following days, the ranch settled into a new sense of security. Elias replaced broken boards on the barn, feeling lighter than he had in years. Hannah ventured into the fields at dawn, humming under her breath as she gathered water, feeding the livestock with a renewed spirit. Gus Pemberton lingered at the edge of everyone's mind. He was out there nursing his wounded pride and plotting retaliation. But for now, the McKenna Ranch stood safe. One evening, Elias and Hannah sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in orange and pink. The desert wind was gentle, carrying the scent of sage. Elias looked at Hannah, remembering how stoic she'd been in the face of all her trials. Auction blocks whispered innuendos, gunfire. He cleared his throat. You know, we got married for reasons of necessity. But these last weeks, I've come to care for you more than I ever thought possible. Hannah's eyes glistened. I feel the same, she whispered. I never imagined that being bought at auction could lead to. She laughed softly at the absurdity of it. To a life that feels hopeful. Elias slipped his hand into hers, rough palms meeting slender fingers. They said nothing else for a long moment, content to sit in the hush of twilight. The next morning, life went on chores, repairs a run into town for supplies. Each task felt infused with a sense of promise. Not a perfect life, not a safe one, but a chance to build something true on a foundation of shared trials. Epilogue. Note. News travelled that Gus Pemberton had been seen heading north, possibly to link up with outlaws near the Canadian border. Sheriff Tolland kept a wary eye. Whether or not Gus would return for vengeance remained an open question. But for now, the McKenna Ranch was theirs to keep, with the shadows of debt lifted and a marriage forged in adversity. Elias and Hannah looked ahead to a future that, while uncertain, was finally their own. Through scorching suns and sudden showdowns, Elias McKenna and Hannah Calder learned that even the harshest frontier can give rise to hope when two determined hearts join forces. Their marriage began as a desperate bargain, sealed under the suspicious gazes of Silver Falls, but quickly transformed into a story of courage and devotion. Resisting the lure of illegal riches, they relied on hard work and the help of loyal friends to vanquish both debt and danger. Each sunrise over the McKenna Ranch now symbolizes a new chapter, one in which every challenge is met side by side. If this tale of grit, resilience, and unexpected love touched your heart, please show your support. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stirring stories of the Old West. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you tales of adventure, redemption, and the unbreakable spirit of the frontier. Saddle up and join us on the next ride.